Welcome back to Government 148. In the last segment, we were discussing Yitzhak Rabin's strategy. I mentioned that prior to 1992, he was determined to crush the Intifada. But when he was elected as a prime minister and as a head of the Labour Party in 1992, he did change strategy. And so I want to go into the explanation of the motivation behind the change in Rabin's strategy. What happened was, as a result of the Intifada, Rabin began to realize that a new force is entering Middle East politics, and that is the force of political Islam. And that force is really beginning to impact the Palestinian. So political Islam was an emerging force. It was the most popular and most powerful political force in the Arab and Muslim world. And therefore, Rabin knew full well that if the Islamists win the Palestinians over, it would be much, much tougher for Israel to deal with them than to negotiate with the secular and a much more docile PLO. Therefore, seeing political Islam's handwriting on the wall, Rabin was sufficiently prescient to recognize that time was not running in favor of Israel, and that Israel would be much better off reaching some kind of an accommodation with the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, than risking a potential change in the leadership of the Palestinians going to the Islamists. So to that end, with the help of mediation by the Norwegian diplomats, in August of 1993, Rabin and PLO leader Yasser Arafat worked out a secret agreement to deal with their conflict. Later on, this agreement would become known as the Oslo Peace Accord in deference to the Norwegian help. And more formally, it is called the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangement, or simply Declaration of Principle, DOP. About a month later, in September 13, 1993, the accord was officially announced and signed in the presence of President Bill Clinton during a White House ceremony. Later, the accord will be referred to as Oslo I to distinguish it from a subsequent agreement, and in some ways much more substantive agreement, the Oslo II, which was signed in 1995. Going back to Oslo Agreement, as a result of the accord, Palestinians were now permitted to have a self-government of a sort. And this self-government was now called the Palestinian National Authority, or PNA. The short is just Palestinian Authority, PA. The authority was given the responsibility for administering a tiny bit of territory under its control. At the same time, the accord required the Israeli forces to move out of parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. 2 years later, in 1995, Oslo II was signed. This second agreement divided the occupied territories into 3 zones with varying degrees of control given to the Palestinian Authority over each of these areas. Now, the details of both agreements, the Oslo I and the Oslo II, are in your reading assignments. They're too long to recite here or to repeat here. A lot of it we have already mentioned in pieces during the previous lectures. Therefore, I'm not going to address them here. Suffice it to say that Oslo II gave limited power to the Palestinian Authority in Zone A and to a lesser extent in Zone B. Remember, there were three zones, A, B, and C. Zone C, by far the largest part of the territory, nearly 3/4 of the occupied land, that part remained under Israeli control. And then suddenly in November 4th, 1955, Prime Minister Rabin is assassinated. The assassin is a young extremist Zionist who was opposed to any land concessions to Palestinians. So suddenly the fate of Oslo II goes under question. Now, looking back at the Oslo agreements, plural, I'm personally very skeptical that Rabin was willing to accept a truly independent, sovereign Palestinian state adjacent to Israel. I believe that his plan was to give Palestinians limited autonomy on some of the areas in the West Bank, but not statehood in a sovereign sense of that word. Indeed, this is how many analysts who are critical of Israel's policies in the occupied territories viewed Rabin's purpose. And this, of course, includes myself. In other words, they saw the ultimate aim of Oslo Peace Accord as no more than a limited authority given to the Palestinian. Now, with Rabin assassination, therefore, we'll never know his ultimate aims and whether or not he would have modified them with the unfolding realities of Israeli-Palestinian relations. In other words, he showed some flexibility of changing his mind, and whether or not at some point he was willing to accept the two-state solution, something we would never be able to answer because he's no longer with us. After Rabin's assassination, again, Shimon Peres takes over as prime minister until the next election, which occurred in June 1996. This time, the Likud party, under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, wins that election. And remember now, Netanyahu was opposed to the Oslo Accord. So you have a prime minister who is opposed to Oslo Accord. Nevertheless, he is getting a lot of pressure from the United States, and he signs the Wye River Memorandum or Agreement in October of 1998 with Yasser Arafat of the Palestinian Authority, and that agreement commits Israel to implementing Oslo II agreement. So even though Netanyahu is opposed to the agreement, he sees that he really doesn't have much choice other than to begin, at least in name, implementing that agreement. And when I said in name, that's exactly what he did. Netanyahu implements only the tiny part of Israeli troop withdrawal from Area C. He does not follow through with what he had to do. So once again, you see that with Likud coming to power, Israel's willingness to implement the Oslo Agreement and reconciliation with Palestinians sharply diminishes. 3 years later, Netanyahu loses to a new labor leader by the name of Ehud Barak. He is a decorated soldier, probably the most decorated soldier of Israel. And Labor now has a coalition and they're in charge. This is an important development for the following reason. Arguably, one could say that this period marks the closest that Israel and Palestinians have come to achieve a meaningful peace. And this, of course, occurred during Barak's tenure as prime minister. However, at the end, Barak lacked both the courage and the power and perhaps even the inclination to consummate the deal. And he, along with his counterpart, American President Bill Clinton, placed the entire blame for the failure to reach an agreement on none other than the Palestinian Authority leader Yasser Arafat. And they did this by reneging on a pledge to Arafat prior to their meetings in Camp David that should the negotiation fail, no one will be blamed for the failure. So both Bill Clinton and Barak reneged on their promise to Yasser Arafat, and they went on the media. They blamed the whole thing on Arafat, and they said they made themselves feel totally blameless. So now Oslo II is really on life support. In September 2000, Ariel Sharon, the former defense minister, concocted an insidious plan to kill Oslo II. And he did this plan called for provoking an incident that would accomplish this. Escorted by some 1,000 policemen, Sharon made a highly publicized trip to the contested holy site, the Temple Mount for the Jews, or Haram al-Sharif for the Muslims. And Sharon knew full well that this would enrage an already frustrated Palestinians, and that this could lead to a violent confrontation between the police and the Palestinian protesters. That was the plan. Sharon's scheme worked beyond anyone's expectation, including Sharon himself. The Palestinians, exacerbated and despondent by the failure of Oslo II, they came so close and yet it failed. Despondent over the failure to end their misery after more than 3 decades of living under Israeli occupation, which at times were brutal, they started a massive protest that quickly spread, and thus began the second Intifada shaking out. This is also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. The incidents that sparked this second Intifada also had a colossal political payoff for Sharon. The violence from both the second Intifada and Israel's repressive response to quash it convinced many Israelis that peace with Palestinians will not work, at least not in the foreseeable future. So now the Israelis are also giving up on peace. And therefore, if that's the case, what Israel needs at this juncture in time and history is a very tough leader who is willing to overpower the Palestinian and suppress their uprising. Therefore, in March 2002, there was an election, and Sharon ends up trouncing Barak in that election, receiving more than 60% of the votes. He becomes Israel's prime minister for the first time. And now you have an Israeli prime minister which Israeli court had already implicated in the Palestinian massacre in Lebanon after 1982, the Sabra Shatila massacre, in the aftermath of Israel's invasion of Lebanon. In court's judgment, Sharon was held, quote unquote, indirectly responsible for that massacre. So you may remember that we already discussed the Palestinian massacre and Sharon's role in the earlier lecture, so I won't repeat it here. But it is one of those ironies that this new prime minister also has issues with massacres and with Israeli courts. But the fact was that Israelis were looking for a leader that could help them deal with the Palestinian uprising, and no one, they thought, could deal better with it than Sharon. Now, going back to Sharon, he rejected the Oslo peace agreement, and he called it, quote, a moral error of the first order. And he refused to deal with Yasser Arafat, calling him a war criminal. Notice how ironic. A charge by a man who did not set foot in Belgium out of fear of being arrested for war crimes.